At a winter market in Larkspur Falls, everyone laughed at the thin old German shepherd locked inside a rusted cage. The lonely dog endured rejection, shame, and cold while younger dogs were loved, never knowing he carried a hidden gift no one understood. But one lonely former Navy SEAL looked into the dog's tired brown eyes and saw something the crowd had completely missed. He bought the dying dog from the cage, believing he was only saving a forgotten animal from the freezing winter. But soon that old German shepherd would lead the SEAL toward a buried secret that could threaten the lives of an entire town. The dog everyone mocked would make the whole town look at him with respect, gratitude, and awe. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and please like, subscribe, and join us for this unforgettable story. The morning over Larkspur Falls arrived bright and merciless. Snow lay over the northern Minnesota town like a clean white quilt, softening the roofs, the fences, the church steeple, and the long, dark line of pine trees beyond the valley. Sunlight slipped through the pale winter clouds, turning every icicle along the market barn into a small blade of glass. Inside the big timber barn at the edge of town, the Larkspur Falls Winter Market was already alive. Golden lamps hung from the rafters. The smell of waffles, hot coffee, wool coats, pine garlands, and fresh straw drifted together in the cold air. Farmers stood behind wooden tables stacked with eggs, honey, apples, and jars of jam. Children moved from stall to stall with red cheeks and mittened hands. Somewhere near the middle aisle, a litter of puppies wearing little knitted sweaters tumbled over one another while a group of grandmothers laughed as if the world had never broken anyone's heart. Caleb Rourke walked through it all slowly. He was 40 years old, a former Navy SEAL, 6'1", with broad shoulders and the solid, disciplined build of a man who still trained every morning even though no commanding officer ordered him to. His face was handsome in a rugged American way, all clean lines and quiet strength. Angular cheekbones, a strong chin, no beard, and a neatly kept undercut touched with early silver. His long-sleeved green camouflage uniform fit close enough to show his posture, not vanity. He carried himself with the calm precision of a man who had survived storms no weather report could name. But his eyes told another story. They were deep, solemn, and tired, the kind of eyes that had learned to watch doorways before smiles. Caleb had come to the market because his therapist in Duluth had told him, gently but firmly, that silence could become a second prison if a man fed it every day. "Go somewhere with people," she had said. So he had come. He did not come to buy anything. He told himself that 3 times before stepping out of his truck. Then a German shepherd puppy barked near a stall of handmade collars, and Caleb's chest tightened, as if some old hand had reached between his ribs. Ranger. The name rose in him before he could stop it. Ranger had been his German shepherd for 13 years. Black and tan, broad-headed, patient as a saint, stubborn as an old sergeant. In the years after Caleb left the service, Ranger had slept outside his bedroom door every night. When Caleb woke from nightmares with sweat cold on his spine and the echo of rotors in his ears, Ranger would push the door open and press his muzzle against Caleb's hand. No questions, no pity, just weight, warmth, and breath. Ranger had died 6 weeks ago, old and tired, with Caleb's palm resting against his chest until the final breath left him. Since then, the dog bed beside the stone fireplace in Caleb's cabin had remained exactly where it was, washed, empty, waiting for no one. Caleb moved past the puppies. He passed a basket of white rabbits, a pair of barn kittens sleeping under a plaid blanket, and 3 little goats with red bells tied around their necks. The market was warm at its center, bright, almost cheerful enough to feel cruel. Then he heard laughter from the back entrance, not the warm kind. The sound came from beyond the main stalls, near the side doors that opened toward the loading area and the snow-covered parking lot. Caleb turned his head. A cold draft slipped through the barn, carrying with it the smell of diesel, old metal, and something sour beneath the straw. He walked toward it. Near the rear wall, away from the official vendor tables, a rusty iron cage sat on the floor beside a stack of wooden crates. Snow had blown through the cracked door and gathered around its base. A torn cardboard sign hung from the top bar, the words written in thick black marker, "For sale." Inside the cage sat an old German shepherd. He was thin, painfully thin, though there was still height and old strength in the shape of him. His coat was yellow and black, dulled by dirt and winter. His muzzle was silvered with age. Both ears stood upright, but they trembled faintly in the cold. He had no sweater, no blanket, not even a scrap of hay beneath him. Outside, the temperature had fallen near 10 degrees below freezing Celsius. Still, the dog did not whine. He sat upright in that cage like a forgotten sentry at the gate of a ruined kingdom. Beside the cage stood Silas Creed, a 47-year-old man with a long, narrow build and the restless posture of someone always ready to leave before questions arrived. He wore an old dark brown leather jacket over a gray sweater, faded jeans, muddy black boots, and worn leather gloves. A thin scar cut from his left cheekbone toward his jaw, pale against weather-beaten skin. His hair was dirty brown, chopped short without care, and rough stubble shadowed his face. His gray eyes moved constantly, toward the doors, toward the crowd, toward anyone who looked too long. "He's old," Silas said to two young men standing nearby. "Ugly, too. But he can still bark, I figure. Good enough for a shed." The young men laughed. One of them said, "Looks like Winter learned how to grow teeth." Another shook his head. "Nobody's paying real money for that thing." Not everyone laughed. At a nearby bakery table stood Mabel Hart, the 64-year-old owner of Mabel's Hearth Bakery. She was round-faced and rosy-cheeked from years beside ovens, with short silver curls escaping from under a red-knitted cap. Flour dusted the white apron tied over her cream wool dress and dark red cardigan. Her pale blue eyes fixed on the cage with open sorrow, but her mouth stayed shut. She was the kind of woman who fed half the town and scolded the other half, yet even she seemed afraid to step too close to Silas. A few feet away, an 11-year-old boy named Owen Pike stood clutching a paper cup of hot cocoa. He was small for his age, thin, with messy light brown hair sticking out from beneath a mustard-yellow beanie. His blue-gray eyes were wide and uncertain. A small green backpack hung from one shoulder, and a nature sketchbook peeked from its front pocket. He looked at the dog the way children look at things adults pretend not to see. Owen took one step forward. His mother gently pulled him back. Caleb saw that, and something inside him turned cold. It was not the laughter that hurt most. Cruel people had never surprised him. It was the quiet hesitation of the decent ones. The way kindness stopped at the border of inconvenience, the way a whole room could look at suffering and call it someone else's problem. He stepped closer. Silas noticed him then. His eyes flicked over Caleb's frame, his clean-shaven face, the military posture, the green camouflage sleeves. "You buying, soldier?" Silas asked. "Or just admiring the museum piece?" Caleb did not answer. He crouched in front of the cage. The old shepherd's eyes lifted to him. They were brown, deep, and strangely clear, not soft exactly, not pleading. They were the eyes of an animal that had measured the world and found it dangerous but had not surrendered its dignity to it. Caleb removed one glove. The cold bit into his skin at once, but he placed his bare hand flat against the snowy floor just outside the bars. The dog did not move. Around them, the market noise faded to a dull murmur. Children laughed somewhere far away. A goat bell chimed. A coffee grinder buzzed. But in that small pocket of cold air near the loading door, time narrowed to a man, a cage, and an old dog who looked too tired to hope. "It's all right," Caleb said quietly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The shepherd's nose twitched. Slowly, with the caution of a creature that had paid dearly for trusting too soon, he leaned forward. His breath passed through the bars in a faint white cloud. He sniffed Caleb's fingers. Then he touched his cold nose to Caleb's knuckle. It lasted less than a second, but Caleb felt it like a bell struck in an empty church. For 6 weeks his cabin had been silent. For 6 weeks he had walked past Ranger's empty bed and told himself grief was just a room he had to learn to live inside. But now this old dog, this thin, unwanted creature in a cage, had reached through the cold and placed one fragile spark in his hand. Caleb swallowed hard. The shepherd's eyes did not leave his. And then something strange happened. The dog turned his head sharply toward Silas, not with fear, with recognition. A low sound rose in his chest, so deep and quiet that only Caleb seemed to hear it. Silas stopped smiling. For one brief moment, his scarred face tightened, not with anger, but with the startled look of a man seeing a locked door move by itself. Then the expression vanished. Silas kicked snow away from his boot and snapped, "He growls at everybody. Told you, old and mean." But Caleb had seen it. That growl had not been random. It had carried memory. And memory, Caleb knew, was the one thing no cage could hold forever. He stood. "How much?" Caleb asked. Silas's smile returned, crooked and unpleasant. "For him? You serious? How much?" One of the young men laughed again. "Man, don't waste your money. That dog's half ghost." Caleb looked at him once, and the laughter died in the young man's throat. Silas named a price too high for mercy and too low for a clean conscience. Caleb reached into his wallet. There was not much cash inside. He had enough to pay bills, buy groceries, keep the cabin warm. He looked at the money for a heartbeat, then at the dog. Some choices did not feel like decisions. They felt like recognizing orders given by the soul. Caleb handed Silas the bills, but as he did, he shifted his phone in his other hand and took quick photos. The cage, the cardboard sign, Silas's face, the old blue truck outside with its rusted bumper and snow-packed tires. He did it without drama, without threat. He had not survived special operations by mistaking urgency for carelessness. He paid to get the dog out of the cold. The rest would come later. Silas counted the money and gave a dry laugh. "Congratulations! You bought yourself a pile of bones that eats." Caleb's voice stayed calm. "No, I bought him time." That quiet answer moved through the little crowd like wind through dry leaves. Mabel stepped away from her bakery table. Without asking permission, she pulled a thick wool shawl from the back of her chair and brought it over. Up close, her eyes looked wet, though her chin remained stubborn. "Take this," she said, pushing the shawl into Caleb's hands. "It's old, but it's warm, like half the people in this town." Caleb nodded. "Thank you, ma'am. Don't ma'am me unless you plan to buy cinnamon rolls next week," she said, but her voice trembled. Owen came next. He moved fast, as if courage might run out if he walked too slowly. He placed a small paper bag of dog biscuits near Caleb's boot, then backed away. "For him," Owen whispered. Caleb looked at the boy. "What's your name?" "Owen." "Thank you, Owen." The boy's face flushed redder than the cold could explain. Caleb opened the cage. For a moment the old shepherd stayed where he was. He looked at the open door, then at Caleb, then at the snow beyond the barn. Freedom, Caleb thought, could frighten a creature that had learned too long from confinement. "Easy," Caleb said. The dog stepped forward. His first step was unsteady. His second nearly failed. Caleb did not grab him. He only held the shawl open, close enough to help, far enough not to insult what remained of the dog's pride. The old shepherd emerged from the cage and stood beside him, thin, shivering, proud. The young men no longer laughed. Mabel crossed herself quietly, as if she had just watched a small resurrection no preacher would know how to explain. Owen smiled with his mouth pressed tight, fighting tears in the heroic way only children do. Caleb wrapped the wool shawl around the dog's shoulders. "You need a name," he murmured. The shepherd looked up at him. Not helplessly, expectantly. Caleb studied the silver muzzle, the solemn eyes, the way the dog sat upright despite hunger and cold, like some ancient guardian posted at the last door between cruelty and grace. "Bishop," Caleb said. The dog blinked. "That's what you are," Caleb whispered. "Old Bishop." He guided Bishop toward the side exit. Snow swept across the threshold. The market seemed to part for them, not dramatically, not like a parade, but with the embarrassed tenderness of people realizing they had nearly failed a test of the heart. At the truck, Caleb opened the passenger door instead of the bed. Bishop looked at the seat, then at Caleb, as if uncertain such dignity was allowed. "Come on," Caleb said. "You're riding up front." He lifted Bishop carefully. The dog was lighter than he should have been. Too light. Caleb placed him on the seat and tucked Mabel's shawl around him. Bishop lowered himself with a faint sigh, but his eyes stayed open. Before Caleb closed the door, Bishop turned his head back toward the market. Silas Creed stood near the loading entrance, half hidden by blowing snow. His face had darkened. One gloved hand rested on the open door of his old blue truck. Bishop growled again. Small, controlled, certain. Caleb heard it, and a line of unease moved through him. He looked from Bishop to Silas, then back again. "Yeah," Caleb said under his breath. "I saw him too." He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. Warm air coughed weakly through the vents. Outside, the winter market glowed gold behind them, full of noise, laughter, and ordinary life. Inside the truck, there was only the sound of Bishop's shallow breathing and Caleb's hand resting near, but not touching, the dog's head. As he pulled away, Caleb glanced into the rearview mirror. Silas remained in the snow, watching. Bishop lay wrapped in the shawl, trembling, but his eyes did not close. The old dog had left the cage behind, but Caleb felt with a certainty he could not explain that Bishop had not been fully rescued yet. He had only found the man who would walk with him toward whatever had been buried beneath all that winter white. The old blue pickup climbed the narrow road out of Larkspur Falls, its tires pressing dark tracks into the fresh snow. Beside Caleb Rourke, Warwick, the old German shepherd, lay wrapped in Mabel Hart's wool shawl, his yellow-black coat still damp with melted frost. Caleb had placed him on the passenger seat instead of the truck bed, though the dog seemed uncertain what to do with such mercy. His body trembled beneath the shawl, but his head remained lifted, his brown eyes watching the windshield, the mirrors, the road, the world. Caleb kept the heater on high. The truck smelled of wet wool, cold metal, and faint dog musk. For most men, that might have been unpleasant. To Caleb, it felt almost holy. He did not reach over to pet the dog. Not yet. Trust, he knew, was not a door a man kicked open. It was a porch light left burning until someone dared to come near. "You'll be warm soon?" Caleb said. The dog's ear twitched. Caleb's cabin stood at the edge of the pine woods, 2 miles beyond the last painted houses of Larkspur Falls. It was a modest place built of dark timber and stone, with a sloped roof heavy with snow, a narrow porch, and large front windows facing the distant line of Glass Creek. In summer, the creek glittered between the trees. In winter, it lay half hidden beneath ice, quiet as a secret sleeping under glass. When Caleb parked, he sat a moment with both hands on the wheel. He had brought dogs home before. Only one had mattered like family. The cabin still carried traces of Ranger. A worn leather leash hung from a hook by the door. A ceramic bowl sat clean beneath the kitchen window. Beside the stone fireplace, the old dog bed remained in its place, flattened at the center by 13 years of faithful weight. Caleb had not moved it. Some grief was not clutter. Some grief was furniture of the soul. He opened the passenger door and carefully lifted the shepherd down. The dog was lighter than he should have been. Too much bone beneath too much pride. His paws touched the snowy ground, and he stood a moment breathing in the cold pine air. "This is it," Caleb said. "Not much, but it's quiet." The dog looked toward the cabin, then toward the woods, then back at Caleb. Caleb opened the front door. The shepherd did not rush in. He stopped at the threshold, his ears angled forward. His nose worked slowly. He studied the room from the doorway, the kitchen to the left, the fireplace ahead, the hallway to the bedroom, the staircase to the loft, the back door near the mudroom. He looked at each window, each corner, each shadow beneath the furniture. Caleb froze. That was not the behavior of a stray. It was the habit of an animal trained to enter a room and understand danger before comfort. The dog stepped inside only after he had finished reading the space. Caleb shut the door gently behind them. Warmth from the fireplace touched the room in soft waves. Caleb had banked the coals before leaving, and now he added split pine logs until a steady flame climbed up the stone throat of the chimney. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, black coffee, old leather, and the faint loneliness of a place too often occupied by only one heartbeat. The shepherd stood near the rug, still wrapped in the shawl. His eyes found Ranger's bed. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he lowered his head and moved away from it, choosing instead a bare patch of floor several feet from the hearth. Caleb felt something inside him bend. "Yeah," he murmured. "I know." He filled a large basin with warm water and brought towels from the linen closet. The dog watched every movement but did not resist when Caleb knelt beside him. The first touch was careful. Caleb's hands moved with the same steadiness that had once disarmed worse things than fear. Mud loosened from the old coat. Ice melted from the fur along the chest. The dog's yellow-black markings emerged slowly beneath neglect, faded but still noble. His muzzle was silver, his shoulders narrow from hunger, yet beneath the weakness remained the frame of a strong, working dog. As Caleb cleaned him, he found the signs of a hard life. Dry skin beneath the fur, old scars hidden near the collar line, a pale band where something had once rubbed too tight, and a small blurred mark inside one ear. Caleb did not stare too long at any of it. Pain deserved witness, not spectacle. "You've been through it," he said softly. The shepherd stood still, though once his legs trembled so badly Caleb had to support his chest. Afterward, Caleb warmed a simple meal on the stove, rice, broth, and soft bits of chicken left from the previous night. He placed the bowl near the fireplace and stepped back. The dog did not eat. He watched Caleb. Caleb understood. He walked to the far side of the room, leaned against the counter, and folded his arms. Only then did the dog lower his head. He ate slowly, without greed. Every bite was measured. When he finished, he licked the bowl once, then sat back as though waiting for permission to exist there. Caleb looked toward Ranger's bed again. The shepherd did not. Instead, the old dog settled on the floor near the hearth, close enough to feel warmth, far enough to leave the bed untouched. That small courtesy undid Caleb more than neediness ever could. For the first time since Ranger died, Caleb sat in the armchair and did not turn away from the empty bed. He watched the new dog sleep lightly, one ear still awake. Night came early. Snow brushed the windows. The woods darkened. Caleb tried to read, failed, and finally closed the book on his chest. Around midnight a sound woke him. Not barking, not scratching. A single, soft thump. Caleb opened his eyes. The shepherd stood in the center of the room, facing the hallway. His posture had changed. He was no longer simply tired. His body had gone still with purpose. One paw lifted, then lowered. His nose pointed toward the closed drawer of the small table near Caleb's bedroom door. Caleb sat up slowly. "What is it?" The dog glanced back at him, then at the drawer again. Caleb rose and opened it. Inside were things he had avoided touching. Ranger's old brush, a folded bandana, a cracked tennis ball, and a photograph of Caleb kneeling beside Ranger on the porch 2 summers earlier. In the photo, Caleb was smiling in a way he barely recognized. The shepherd stepped closer, sniffed the open drawer, then sat down. He did not take anything. He only sat there, solemn and quiet, like a priest before an altar. Caleb's throat tightened. "How did you know?" he whispered. The dog looked at him with those deep brown eyes, and for one strange second Caleb felt that the cabin had not gained a guest. It had gained a witness. The next morning dawned pale and blue. Caleb drove into town with the shepherd wrapped in a clean blanket on the passenger seat. The sign above the small clinic read Larkspur Veterinary Care, painted in green letters beside the image of a paw print and a pine branch. Inside, the clinic smelled of antiseptic, cedar shavings, and warm animal fur. Behind the counter stood Dr. Nora Bellamy, 36 years old, compact and quick-moving, with chestnut blonde hair tied in a messy high ponytail and a dusting of freckles across her fair cheeks. Her green eyes were sharp with intelligence, and her mouth had the slightly amused shape of a woman who had seen both human foolishness and animal courage before breakfast. She wore a white veterinary coat over pale blue scrubs, white clinic shoes, and a stethoscope around her neck. "Well," Nora said, looking from Caleb to the dog, "that is not a grocery run." "Found him at the winter market," Caleb said. "Back loading area, bad condition." Nora's humor faded just enough. "Bring him in." The shepherd allowed Caleb to guide him into the exam room. He did not like the metal table, but he did not fight it. Nora moved carefully, speaking to him before each touch. "Good boy," she murmured. "Old gentleman, aren't you?" She examined his eyes, teeth, paws, ribs, and ears. She weighed him. She checked for a microchip, then frowned. No chip. Caleb said nothing. Nora inspected the blurred mark inside his ear with a small light. "This is odd." "What?" "Looks like an old ID mark, not readable now. Someone may have damaged it, or it faded badly. Hard to say." The dog turned his head toward the door just before footsteps passed in the hallway. Nora noticed. Then, almost casually, she raised 2 fingers and made a small downward motion. The dog sat. Caleb stared. Nora raised her eyebrows. "You taught him that?" "No." She made another small gesture, palm flat, fingers low. The dog lowered himself carefully onto his belly. Nora went very still. "That is not random," she said. Caleb felt the room narrow. Nora straightened, thoughtful now. "He's underweight, a little dehydrated, but not ruined. His muscle memory is strong. His discipline is stronger. This dog was trained by someone who knew what they were doing: search and rescue, security, service work, something structured." Caleb looked at the old shepherd. For a dog who had been sold like junk at the edge of a market, he suddenly seemed less like something discarded and more like something hidden. "Can he recover?" Caleb asked. "With food, warmth, rest, and patience?" "Yes." Nora softened. "He may never be young again, but old does not mean finished." Caleb gave a quiet nod. He showed Nora the photos from the market, the cage, the sign, the man, the truck. Nora's mouth tightened. "Silas Creed." "You know him?" "I know of him. Shows up around county auctions. Sometimes with animals he claims he picked up, never enough proof to pin anything serious on him." She handed the phone back. "Take this to Sheriff Grace Hollis, today." Caleb did not argue. The sheriff's office sat across from the town hall, a brick building with a flag snapping in the winter wind. Sheriff Grace Hollis was 45, tall and solidly built, with a square, steady face, warm brown skin weathered by Minnesota winters, and dark hair cut just above her shoulders. Her brown eyes were calm, but not soft. She wore a dark winter sheriff's uniform with a heavy jacket, black snow boots, and a duty belt that seemed less like authority than responsibility. Grace listened without interruption. She studied the photos. She wrote down Silas's plate number. Then she looked at the dog lying beside Caleb's chair. "He yours now?" she asked. Caleb hesitated. The shepherd looked up at him. "Looks that way," Caleb said. Grace almost smiled. "Then keep him close. I'll check Creed's activity around the market. And Caleb?" He met her eyes. "This town has pretty snow," she said, "but pretty snow can cover ugly tracks." By afternoon, Caleb and the shepherd returned to the cabin. On the drive home, Caleb spoke the name aloud for the first time since leaving the market. "Bishop." The dog's ear flicked. "Yeah," Caleb said. "That's you." Over the next several days, the cabin changed by inches. Caleb bought proper food, medicine, a new collar, and a heavy blanket. Bishop accepted each item cautiously, as if waiting for kindness to reveal its price. Caleb did not demand affection. He simply became predictable. Meals at the same time, walks at the same pace, firewood stacked before dark, a hand offered, never forced. Bishop learned Caleb's silences. He noticed when Caleb stared too long at the old photographs in the drawer. He noticed when Caleb woke before dawn and stood outside in the snow because breathing indoors had become too difficult. He noticed the empty dog bed by the fire and continued not to claim it. One afternoon, Mabel Hart left a paper bag on Caleb's porch. Scraps of plain roasted chicken, a small loaf of bread, and a note written in looping letters. "For the old gentleman, the bread is for you, unless the dog has better manners." Caleb laughed once unexpectedly. It startled him. 2 days later, he saw Owen Pike standing outside the fence, pretending to look at pine cones while staring at Bishop. Caleb opened the gate. "You can say hello," he said. Owen approached slowly. Bishop sat still, allowing the boy to come near. Owen's small hand hovered above the dog's head, trembling. "He looks like he knows things," Owen whispered. Caleb looked at Bishop. "I think he does." Near the end of the week, Caleb met Avery Quinn by Glass Creek while she supervised a small group of children sketching winter birds. Avery was 34, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair tied low at the nape of her neck, gentle green eyes, and a calm teacher's voice that could settle a crowd without crushing it. She wore an olive wool coat, a cream turtleneck, brown boots, and a beige scarf tucked neatly at her throat. Bishop watched the creek for a long time that day, too long. But Caleb told himself old dogs had old habits. That evening, as dusk gathered blue among the pines, Caleb stepped outside to bring in firewood. Bishop followed him into the yard. Near the big pine behind the cabin, the dog stopped. He sniffed the snow. Then he began to dig. "Bishop," Caleb said, "leave it." The dog did not stop. Snow flew beneath his paws. His movements were not frantic, only determined. Caleb frowned and stepped closer. A strip of dark leather appeared beneath the white. Caleb knelt. His hand closed around a collar. Not Bishop's. Ranger's. The old black leather collar was stiff from cold, the small metal tag dulled but readable. Caleb had searched for it in the fall after Ranger died. He had thought it lost somewhere in the woods. Now it lay in his palm, brought up from beneath the snow by a dog who had never known Ranger. For a long moment Caleb could not speak. Bishop sat beside him, breathing clouds into the winter air. Caleb gave a broken little laugh, half pain, half wonder. "What are you doing, old man?" he whispered. "Digging up ghosts?" Bishop looked past him. Not at the house, not at the market road, toward the distant white line of Glass Creek. Caleb followed his gaze, but saw only trees, snow, and the pale shimmer of ice in the fading light. He did not understand, not yet. But with Ranger's collar cold in his hand, and Bishop sitting like a silent guardian beside him, Caleb felt the strange certainty that some things were not found by accident. Sometimes grief buried what the heart could not carry, and sometimes an old dog came along and began digging. By the second week, Larkspur Falls had begun to notice the old German shepherd, not all at once. Small towns rarely changed their minds in a single breath. They did it the way snow melted from a roof, drop by drop, under a sun that seemed too gentle to matter until the whole eave began to drip. Bishop still moved slowly, but food and warmth had put a little strength back into his legs. His yellow-black coat remained rough, his muzzle silver, his ribs still too visible beneath the fur. Yet there was dignity in him now that made people look twice. He walked beside Caleb Ruark through town with his head level and his ears upright, like an old judge making rounds before breakfast. Caleb did not become talkative. He was still the 40-year-old former Navy SEAL with the clean-shaven angular face, the neat silver-touched undercut, the broad shoulders, and the long-sleeved green camouflage clothes that made him look as if discipline had been stitched into the seams. He still answered most questions with fewer words than a polite man should need, but Bishop changed the shape of those silences. People who once nodded at Caleb from a safe distance now stopped to ask, "How's the old fellow?" Or, "Is he eating better?" Or, "Did you really find him at the winter market?" Caleb would answer, "He's improving." Bishop, meanwhile, would stare at them with such grave patience that children began calling him Mayor Bishop. Mabel Hart claimed he looked less like a mayor and more like a retired tax collector who had seen every lie in 3 counties. That made Caleb laugh once, quietly, while standing outside her bakery. Mabel heard it. "Well, glory be," she said, holding a tray of cinnamon rolls against her round, apron-covered belly. "The man does come with sound effects." Mabel's bakery sat near the center of town, painted butter yellow with red trim, and windows that fogged every morning from the heat of the ovens. Mabel herself was 64, rosy-cheeked, silver-haired, round as a warm loaf, and possessed of a tongue sharp enough to cut pie crust. Her humor had become armor after her husband died years earlier, leaving her with a bakery, a small house, and too many memories that arrived whenever the church bells rang. One morning, Caleb found her standing on the sidewalk, glaring up at the sagging wooden awning above her storefront. Heavy snow had bent one corner dangerously low. "I was going to fix it myself," Mabel announced. Caleb looked at her short frame, her flour-dusted cardigan, and the broom in her hand. "With that? It has a handle. That makes it a tool. It makes it a broom. That is exactly the kind of narrow thinking that keeps men from enjoying life." Caleb climbed the ladder and repaired the bracket, while Bishop lay near the bakery door, accepting admiration from customers with the exhausted patience of a saint at a noisy festival. Mabel rewarded them with black coffee for Caleb and a plain biscuit baked especially for Bishop. While Caleb tightened the last screw, Mabel's humor thinned. "My Frank used to say the creek smelled wrong some winters," she said. Caleb paused. "Glass Creek?" Mabel wiped her hands on her apron, though they were already clean. "He fished there since he was old enough to lie about the size of trout. Then, one year, he said the water changed. Not always. Just after thaw, or after heavy snow. He thought something was coming down from the ridge." "Voss Ridge?" She looked away. Frank asked too many questions. Then he got a letter from a lawyer so expensive the envelope looked rich. He stopped asking. The wind moved powdered snow across the street. Mabel forced a smile back onto her face. Anyway, he was stubborn, also snored like a tractor in mud. Don't go making him into a saint. But Caleb had already seen the grief beneath the joke. It had the same shape as his own, laughter built around a locked room. Later that week, Bishop found Owen Pike behind the old equipment shed near the school. Owen was 11, small and thin, with light brown hair that never stayed beneath his mustard yellow hat, and blue-gray eyes that seemed always ready to apologize. His parents' divorce had turned him quiet, and quiet children often became targets for louder ones. That afternoon, 2 older boys had called him Rabbit Heart after he dropped his sketchbook in the snow. By the time Caleb arrived, Owen was sitting inside the shed with his knees pulled to his chest. Bishop did not rush him. The old dog simply entered, circled once, and lay down several feet away, close enough to be company, far enough to leave Owen his pride. Caleb stood in the doorway. "You all right?" he asked. Owen shrugged. "That usually means no." The boy sniffed, embarrassed. "They said I'm scared of everything." Caleb leaned against the doorframe. "Are you?" Owen looked at Bishop. "Maybe." "Fear isn't the problem," Caleb said. "Staying in the shed forever is." Owen wiped his face with his sleeve. Bishop, as if deciding the boy had earned it, stretched his muzzle forward and rested it gently on the edge of Owen's boot. The boy let out a small laugh that broke halfway into a sob. After that, Owen began coming by Caleb's cabin on Saturday mornings. He helped stack kindling and refill Bishop's water bowl. He brought a nature sketchbook filled with careful drawings: chickadees, fox tracks, deer prints, the bend of Glass Creek in autumn, the frozen reeds near the north bank. Caleb noticed the dates beside each drawing. "You keep records?" he asked. Owen nodded. "Dad says it's weird." "It's not weird. Mabel says it's weird but useful." "That sounds like Mabel." Owen showed him older pages of Glass Creek, drawn 2 years before. Clear water, minnows beneath the surface, birds along the bank. Then he showed Caleb recent pages. Fewer fish, less bird activity. A note written in small letters: "Strange metal smell after thaw." Caleb read the words twice. Bishop stood beside him, nose angled toward the window. The following Thursday, Avery Quinn's class went to the creek for a winter nature lesson. Avery was 34, tall and slender, with chestnut brown hair tied low at the neck and gentle green eyes that somehow managed to notice every child at once. She wore an olive wool coat, a cream scarf, brown boots, and the calm expression of a woman who believed children became braver when adults stopped shouting instructions at them. She had grown up in Wisconsin, moved to Larkspur Falls after her mother's death, and built a life around teaching children to see wonder before the world taught them to hurry past it. Caleb came along because Owen had asked if Bishop could visit. The children loved Bishop immediately. Bishop endured it like royalty under public obligation. A little girl named Lucy Bell, 7 years old, with dark curls under a red pom-pom hat and a gap where one front tooth had recently surrendered, followed Bishop around with absolute devotion. She carried a bright red scarf that kept slipping loose no matter how often Avery retied it. Near the creek, a gust of wind took the scarf. Lucy chased it before anyone could stop her. Avery called out. Caleb moved at once. The scarf flew over a low rise, past a cluster of young pines. For one long second, Lucy disappeared behind the trees. Bishop sprang forward, not fast like a young dog, but with startling purpose. Nose low, tail straight, he followed the scarf's scent through the snow. Caleb and Avery followed him, boots crunching hard. They found Lucy crouched beneath a pine, frightened but safe, clutching the scarf where it had snagged on a branch. Avery dropped to her knees and wrapped the child in her arms. "Oh, sweetheart," she breathed. "You scared 10 years off me, and teachers don't have that many to spare." Lucy cried into her coat. Bishop sat beside them, solemnly accepting the child's small hand on his head. The children talked about it all afternoon. By sunset, half the town had heard that Bishop had rescued Lucy, though Caleb insisted she had only gone 50 yards. Mabel declared 50 yards was practically the Oregon Trail if you were 7. That was when the re-hook came, quietly, while everyone else was still relieved. As Avery gathered the class sketches near the creek bank, Bishop stepped away from the children and stopped at the frozen edge of Glass Creek. His entire body changed. The softness left him. His ears pushed forward. His nose hovered above the snow, then lowered toward a dark seam in the ice. Caleb watched him inhale once, sharply. Then Bishop backed away. He refused the water. Avery noticed. "Is something wrong?" Caleb crouched beside him. "Bishop?" The old dog did not look at Caleb. He stared at the creek, then lifted one front paw and scraped at the snow along the bank. Once, twice, not frantic, deliberate. Beneath the white crust, a faint gray-green stain marked the ice. It was small, easy to miss. Nothing dramatic enough to frighten a crowd. Yet Bishop stood over it like he had found a grave. Caleb leaned closer. There was a smell beneath the cold, metallic, bitter, wrong. For a moment, the happy noise of the school children faded behind him. Caleb felt that old operational stillness return, not fear, not anger, but the sharp internal click of a man realizing a room was not as safe as it looked. Avery's face had gone pale. "I've smelled that before," she said quietly. Caleb looked at her. "In autumn," she said, "after the first hard rain. A few kids got rashes after wading downstream. Nothing serious, the clinic said. But I remember the smell." Bishop scraped the snow once more, then sat back, eyes fixed upstream. That evening, Caleb did not sleep easily. He told himself not to leap to conclusions. A strange smell was not proof. A stain in ice was not a crime. A dog's reaction was not evidence. But Owen's sketchbook sat open on his kitchen table. Fewer fish. Metal smell after thaw. "Who don't drink North Bank anymore," Owen had written, misspelling deer in a way that made the note feel more honest, not less. The next morning, Caleb walked the public trail along Glass Creek with Bishop. He did not cross fences. He did not step onto private land. He simply followed the county path that wound through the pines toward the ridge. Upstream, the trees thinned. Beyond them rose Voss Ridge Estate. The estate belonged to Harlan Voss, the wealthiest man in Larkspur Falls. He was 63, tall and still strong through the shoulders, with silver hair combed smoothly back and a long, elegant face that looked carved for portraits beside fireplaces. He wore expensive black cashmere coats in winter, dark gloves, polished boots, and a wine-colored scarf that made him appear both generous and untouchable. His smile was warm in public, his voice soft, and his donations famous. A new roof for the church, books for the school, lights for the Christmas tree in the square. People spoke his name with gratitude and caution. The trail stopped at a wooden fence marking the boundary near Voss land. Caleb stayed on the legal side. Bishop pulled toward a ditch half buried in snow near the public easement. Caleb saw it then. A narrow run of discolored meltwater seeping from beneath a tangle of broken branches. It moved under the snow toward a feeder stream that led down to Glass Creek. He took photos, nothing more. No trespassing, no accusations. Just images, dates, location markers. Bishop stood beside him, tense and silent. A truck passed far up the ridge road, too distant to identify. Caleb lowered his phone and watched until it disappeared between the pines. On the walk back, Jonah Reed came along the trail carrying a coil of rope over one shoulder. Jonah was 58, a local farmer with a weathered face, tired brown eyes, and a short salt and pepper beard. He wore a waxed brown farm coat, green knit cap, denim work pants, and black rubber boots crusted with frozen mud. He had the manner of a kind man who had spent too many years measuring his words before speaking them. He looked at Bishop first. "That dog doesn't like the creek," Jonah said. Caleb studied him. "Should he?" Jonah's jaw worked once. "My cows didn't either." "Not from that north branch." "What happened?" Jonah looked toward the ridge, then away. "Nothing I could prove." That was all he said. But sometimes a man's refusal to finish a sentence told more than the sentence could. By late afternoon, Caleb and Bishop stood on a snowy rise overlooking the distant roofs of Voss Ridge Estate. Smoke curled from chimneys. The mansion windows flashed gold in the winter sun. It looked peaceful, almost noble, a kingdom set above the town. Bishop stared at it without blinking. Caleb rested a hand on the old dog's head. "You know something, don't you?" he said. Bishop did not answer. The wind moved through the pines, low and whispering, carrying the cold scent of water, metal, and secrets. Caleb looked from the dog to the ridge, then back toward the town below where children played. Ovens warmed bread, and good people tried not to see what fear had taught them to ignore. For the first time since bringing Bishop home, Caleb understood that the old dog had not only entered his life to be saved, he had arrived carrying a direction. Caleb Rourke did not sleep much after the walk near Voss Ridge. By sunrise, the photographs from the public trail were printed on his kitchen table beside Owen Pike's nature notes. Bishop lay near the hearth, his yellow-black body stretched across the rug, his silvered muzzle resting on his paws. He seemed asleep, but Caleb had learned the old dog was rarely unaware. One ear always listened. One eye always knew when Caleb moved. Outside the cabin windows, the northern Minnesota morning shone almost too beautifully. Snow glittered on the pines. The sky was a pale, honest blue. Glass Creek, far beyond the trees, held the light like a ribbon of frozen glass. A man could look at a morning like that and believe nothing rotten existed beneath it. Caleb knew better. He dressed in his long-sleeved green camouflage uniform, the familiar fitted fabric settling over his broad shoulders like discipline returning to its post. At 40, he still moved with the quiet precision of his SEAL years, though now his missions began with coffee, printed photographs, and the stubborn refusal to ignore a dog's warning. He took Bishop to the sheriff's office before the town had fully opened. Sheriff Grace Hollis listened with her elbows on the desk and her hands folded beneath her chin. She was steady as ever, her dark winter uniform crisp, her brown eyes thoughtful. A scar the size of a grain of rice marked the bridge of her nose, almost invisible unless the light caught it. Caleb had heard she got it years ago, breaking up a fight outside a bar, when she was still a deputy and still believed calm words could stop every foolish man. She had since learned calm words worked best when backed by evidence. Grace studied the photos. "These were taken from the county trail?" she asked. "Yes." "You didn't cross the fence?" "No." "Good." She tapped one image with a pen. "Because if this goes anywhere, the first thing Voss's attorney will do is ask how you got it." Caleb nodded. "I figured." Grace leaned back. "Suspicion isn't proof. A smell isn't proof. A dog's reaction isn't proof." Bishop raised his head as if mildly offended. Grace glanced at him. "No offense, old man." Caleb almost smiled. Grace looked back to the photographs. "But a pattern matters. Owen's notes, Jonah's hesitation, Mabel's story about Frank, your photos from public land. Those are pieces. Not enough yet. Enough to start carefully." "Carefully," Caleb repeated. "In this town, careful is how you live long enough to tell the truth." By noon, Avery Quinn had joined them at the small public library with a folder of observations from her class nature walks. Avery moved with quiet purpose, her olive wool coat dusted with snow, her chestnut brown hair tied low at her neck. She had the kind of gentleness people sometimes mistook for softness until they saw how stubbornly she protected children. When she opened her folder, every page was labeled by date, location, and weather. "I didn't call it evidence," she said. "I called it concern." Grace nodded. "Concern is allowed." Dr. Nora Bellamy arrived next, carrying a clinic binder under one arm and a travel mug under the other. Her white coat was hidden beneath a navy parka, but her messy ponytail and freckled, alert face made her look exactly like a woman who had already argued with 3 cats and won only one negotiation. "I'm not making environmental claims," Nora said before anyone asked. "I'm a vet, not a creek wizard, but I can document animal symptoms reported near certain water access points. That's medical observation, not courtroom poetry." Mabel Hart had come too, though she claimed she was only delivering cinnamon rolls. She wore her red cardigan under a thick cream coat, flour still dusting one sleeve like snow that had learned to bake. The moment she entered, the library smelled faintly of butter and courage. The librarian, Edith Marlowe, looked up from the front desk. She was a thin woman in her early 70s, with silver hair pinned in a severe bun, long fingers, and spectacles hanging from a chain around her neck. She had spent 40 years guarding books from sticky hands, careless coffee cups, and people who thought history began when they were born. Her expression was stern, but when Bishop entered beside Caleb, she placed a folded blanket under the reading table without a word. For the next hour, they sorted pieces. Avery's student observations, Owen's drawings, Nora's notes from pet owners, Caleb's photos, Mabel's memory of her late husband Frank asking questions and receiving a lawyer's letter instead of answers. Grace wrote everything down. No one accused Harlan Voss outright. That was important. Harlan was not simply rich, he was woven into Larkspur Falls like a gold thread in a winter quilt. His money had repaired the church roof, bought new band uniforms, sponsored the Christmas lights, and paid for the town's spring cleanup 3 years running. People did not like imagining that the hand feeding the town might also be poisoning its water. Bishop lay beneath the table, silent. Then, just as Grace closed her notebook, the old dog rose. He walked to a lower shelf near the local history section and stopped. Caleb frowned. "Bishop." The dog pressed his nose against the spine of an old green binder. Edith Marlowe stiffened. "That is the archive shelf, not a chew toy." Bishop did not chew. He stepped back and sat. Edith, muttering about dogs with library opinions, pulled the binder free. A small envelope slipped from between the pages and fell to the floor. Caleb picked it up. The envelope was yellowed, sealed only by age. Across the front, in faded blue ink, were 3 words, Glass Creek Survey. Avery's face changed. Grace held out her hand. "Let me see that." Inside were copied pages from an old town meeting packet dated 6 years earlier. Most of it was dull language about land use, drainage, and winter runoff. But tucked behind the last page was a grainy photocopy of a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Environmental Engineer Missing After Ridge Survey." Below the headline was a photograph of a lean, middle-aged man standing near Glass Creek with a younger German Shepherd at his side. The dog in the photograph was strong, alert, black and tan. Not old, not thin, not silver-muzzled, but the eyes were the same. Caleb slowly looked down at Bishop. Bishop stared at the photograph without moving. For several seconds, the library held its breath. Mabel whispered, "Lord have mercy." Grace took the clipping from Caleb and read the name beneath the photo. "Thomas Vale." Avery's voice was quiet. "I remember that name. My first year here, some people said he got lost in a storm." Edith Marlowe crossed her arms, her stern face softening around the edges. "Some people said many things. Most of them waited until no one important could hear." Caleb crouched beside Bishop. The old dog did not look at him. His gaze stayed on the younger version of himself in the photograph, as if time had opened a window and called him by a name no one in the room knew yet. The re-hook settled over them like a church bell after the final note. Bishop had not found proof. He had found a ghost with a face, and the ghost had owned a dog. The discovery changed the rhythm of the day. Grace took the archive packet to copy it officially. Avery stayed with Edith to search for more local articles. Nora returned to the clinic to compare Bishop's faded earmark with old working dog registry patterns. Caleb and Bishop left the library in a silence deeper than the one they had brought in. On Main Street, snow fell in small, glittering grains. By late afternoon, Mabel's bakery had filled with the kind of people who pretended they came for bread but stayed for rumors. Caleb sat at a corner table with black coffee. Bishop lay beside his chair, facing the door. Mabel moved behind the counter, round and warm and sharper than anyone gave her credit for. She smiled at customers, handed over loaves, corrected a child's mitten, and still managed to watch Caleb with worried eyes. "You found something," she said when the room thinned. "Maybe." "That means yes, but you're being military about it." Before Caleb could answer, the bell above the bakery door chimed. The room changed, not loudly. No one gasped, no one stepped back, but every conversation lowered itself by half an inch. Harlan Voss entered with snow on the shoulders of his black cashmere coat. He was 63, tall, elegant, and still strong through the chest and arms in the way of a man who had never done hard labor but had always owned land where other men did. His silver hair was combed smoothly back from a long, dignified face. His eyes were a pale blue that looked kind from a distance and cold up close. A wine-colored scarf rested neatly at his throat, and black leather gloves covered hands that had likely signed more checks than they had ever lifted. His smile arrived before his warmth did. "Mabel," he said, voice rich and gentle. "The whole street smells like heaven. You're becoming a danger to public discipline." Mabel smiled, but her fingers tightened around the towel in her hand. Discipline is overrated. So is Cale. Harlan laughed softly. Then his eyes found Caleb. "Mr. Rourke," he said, "I've been hoping to meet you properly." Caleb stood because he had been raised before war taught him suspicion. Harlan Voss. "Guilty." Harlan extended a gloved hand. Caleb shook it once. Harlan's grip was firm, practiced, political. "I heard about what you did at the winter market," Harlan said. His eyes drifted to Bishop. "Rescuing an old dog is no small kindness." Bishop rose. He did not bark. He did not lunge. He stepped between Caleb and Harlan with a quietness that made the gesture more unsettling, not less. His ears came forward. His tail lowered. A low sound gathered in his chest, barely audible beneath the bakery hum. Harlan looked down. For one brief second, his pleasant face forgot itself. Recognition passed through his eyes like a shadow crossing snow. Then the smile returned. "My," he said. "Protective fellow." Caleb had seen enough men lie in enough rooms to know when a face changed before its owner could stop it. "He's selective," Caleb said. Harlan's gaze lifted. "Old dogs can be unpredictable, especially ones with unknown histories." Mabel went still behind the counter. Caleb said, "Do you know his history?" Harlan gave a smooth little laugh. "I only mean strays carry stories we rarely need to hear. Sometimes the merciful thing is to let them rest." It was said kindly. It landed like a warning. Harlan bought a loaf of rye bread he did not seem to want, complimented Mabel's charity toward every lost creature in town, and left with the same graceful confidence with which he had entered. Only after the door closed did Mabel release her breath. "That man can make a compliment sound like offense," she murmured. Caleb looked down at Bishop. The old dog was still staring at the door. After the bakery, Caleb drove straight to Nora's clinic. The winter sun was already sinking behind the roofs, casting amber light across the snow. Bishop sat stiffly in the passenger seat, more alert than he had been all week. Nora met them in the exam room and examined the faded mark inside Bishop's ear again, this time with a magnifying lens and a handheld light. "It's partial," she said. "But look here." Caleb leaned close. The old mark had been damaged, but faint shapes remained. 2 letters, maybe an S and a V, and a sequence that might once have been a registry number. "Could be from a private search and rescue association," Nora said, "or a contracted field survey program. Some environmental teams use trained dogs in rough terrain. Not common, but not unheard of. Could he have belonged to Thomas Vale?" Nora looked at Bishop. "If that photo is real, yes, age fits, breed fits, training fits." Bishop stood very still on the exam mat. Nora softened. "He didn't just wander into your life, Caleb." "No," Caleb said. The word felt heavier than it should have. Meanwhile, Avery stayed at the library until the streetlights came on. Edith Marlowe found 2 more articles from 6 years earlier. One described Thomas Vale as an independent environmental engineer hired by residents concerned about water changes in Glass Creek. Another mentioned that his last known survey route took him near the ridge before a sudden snowstorm struck. The article included a second photograph, clearer than the first. Thomas Vale stood in a field jacket beside the young German shepherd. He was 52, tall and lean, clean-shaven, with brown hair already graying at the temples, and intelligent gray-blue eyes narrowed against the winter sun. His expression was serious but kind, the face of a man who trusted facts more than charm. One hand rested on the dog's head with familiar affection. Avery brought the copy to Caleb's cabin that night. The cabin fire burned low. Bishop lay near the hearth. Caleb took the article from Avery and sat down slowly. He read the caption, "Thomas Vale and search dog Solomon conducting winter waterway survey near Glass Creek." "Solomon," Avery said softly. At the sound of the name, Bishop lifted his head. Caleb stopped breathing for half a second. Avery looked at him. "Say it again." Caleb did. "Solomon." The old German shepherd rose to his feet, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the solemn certainty of a creature answering a bell from another life. He walked to Caleb, pressed his muzzle against the old newspaper copy, and closed his eyes. No one spoke. The fire snapped once in the hearth. Caleb looked at the photograph, at the young dog that had once stood beside Thomas Vale, then at the old dog before him, silvered by years and carrying wounds no article could name. Bishop was not Bishop first. He had been Solomon. And Solomon had belonged to a man who vanished while trying to understand why Glass Creek no longer sang. Caleb sat back, the article trembling slightly in his hand. Outside, the wind moved through the pines and over the frozen creek. The town slept beneath its soft white blanket, peaceful as a storybook village. But in Caleb's cabin, the past had opened its eyes. For 3 days, the name Solomon lived in Caleb Rourke's cabin like a second fire. It did not warm the room. It changed the shadows. Bishop still answered to Bishop when Caleb called him for meals, walks, or medicine. But whenever the old name slipped from Caleb's mouth, quietly, carefully, almost like touching a bruise, the German shepherd would lift his silvered muzzle and look toward him with a gravity that made the air seem older. Solomon. A name from before the cage, before hunger, before Silas Creed's rough voice at the edge of the winter market, before Bishop became the old dog Caleb had carried home under a borrowed shawl. Caleb did not use the name often. It felt like handling a soldier's dog tags found in snow. On the third morning, Avery Quinn arrived at the cabin with a phone number written on a folded note. Her olive coat was dusted white from the walk up the road, and her chestnut hair had escaped its low tie in soft strands around her face. She looked tired, but her green eyes held the firm light of someone who had found the next stone across a dangerous river. "I found Thomas Vale's daughter," she said. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Bishop, lying near the hearth, opened his eyes. "Where?" Caleb asked. "2 towns east. Pine Harbor. Her name is Lydia Vale. She restores antique furniture. I called her workshop, but she didn't want to talk at first." "That makes sense." Avery nodded. "I sent the photograph of Bishop." At that, Bishop rose slowly to his feet. Avery looked at him, then at Caleb. She called back 5 minutes later. By early afternoon, Caleb's old blue pickup rolled into Pine Harbor, a town smaller than Larkspur Falls and quieter under its winter coat. Its main street curved around a frozen pond where children had once skated, but now only wind moved loose snow across the surface. Lydia Vale's workshop stood behind a white clapboard house with green shutters. A hand-painted sign read, "Vale Restoration and Woodcraft." The smell of cedar, old varnish, and sawdust drifted from the open side door. Lydia appeared before Caleb knocked. She was 28, slender but strong in the shoulders and hands, the kind of strength earned from lifting old tables and sanding stubborn wood rather than posing for it. Her dark brown hair fell to her shoulders in loose waves, partly tied back with a strip of leather. Her face was fine-boned, almost delicate, but there was a guarded sharpness around her gray-blue eyes. Small scratches marked her fingers, and a dusting of pale sawdust clung to the sleeve of her brown canvas jacket. She wore a cream turtleneck, black jeans, worn leather boots, and work gloves tucked into one pocket. She looked first at Caleb, then past him. Bishop sat in the snow beside the truck, still and watchful. The color left Lydia's face. For a long moment she did not move. Then she whispered, "Solomon." Bishop's ears shifted forward. He took one step. Lydia covered her mouth with one hand. Not dramatically, not for anyone watching. It was the gesture of a person whose heart had just heard a voice from a locked room. She crossed the yard slowly and knelt in the snow, not caring that the cold soaked through her jeans. Bishop approached her with the careful dignity of an old pilgrim, returning to a temple that had burned and somehow still stood. Lydia held out her hand. He lowered his silvered muzzle into her palm. The sound that left her was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It was both grief and gratitude trying to fit through the same narrow door. "Dad said you'd always find your way," she whispered. "He said you were too stubborn to get lost." Caleb stood back. Avery turned away slightly, giving the moment room. Lydia pressed her forehead to Bishop's brow. The old dog did not wag wildly. He did not jump or cry out. He simply leaned into her, and for a few sacred seconds the snowy yard held 3 lives bound by a man who was no longer there. Inside the workshop, Lydia made coffee. No one drank. The walls were lined with half-restored chairs, cabinet doors, broken frames, and old family photographs waiting for repair. Lydia's workbench was neat, every chisel and brush arranged with almost military order. Caleb noticed that. Grief had made him orderly too. When the world took what mattered, a person sometimes lined up tools just to prove something could still be controlled. Lydia sat across from him, Bishop lying at her feet. "My father was careful," she said. "People call missing men reckless because it makes the story easier. Dad wasn't reckless." "What was he working on?" Caleb asked. Glass Creek. Her fingers closed around her mug. "A group of residents hired him, quietly. They were worried about the water near the ridge, livestock issues, strange smells after thaw, rashes. Small things that were easy to dismiss if you wanted them dismissed." Avery glanced at Caleb. Owen's notes had not been childish imagination after all. Lydia continued. "Dad believed Voss Ridge had old waste storage sites on the property. Industrial materials from before Harlan rebranded the estate into cattle, charity, and Christmas speeches. Dad thought something was leaking into the creek system. Did he have proof?" "He told me he was close." The room seemed to tighten around that word, close. It was one of the cruelest words in the language. Close to home. Close to healing. Close to truth. Close enough for fate to notice and close the door. Lydia looked down at Bishop. "The night before he disappeared, he called me. He said, 'If anything happens, remember Solomon knows the old cabin trail.' I thought he was being dramatic. He could be dramatic when he wanted me to listen." "Old cabin trail?" Caleb asked. "A survey cabin on public forest land. Dad used it when he worked long days near the creek. It belonged to the county once, then nobody maintained it. He kept notebooks there sometimes, backup samples." Avery leaned forward. "Do you know where it is?" Lydia hesitated. Bishop lifted his head. His nose pointed toward the workshop door. Lydia stared at him. "He does," she whispered. That was the re-hook, quiet but undeniable. No map had been unfolded. No address had been spoken. Yet the old dog stood, walked to the door, and waited with the solemn certainty of a creature hearing footsteps from 6 winters ago. Caleb felt the hairs rise along the back of his neck. Not from fear, from recognition. There were instincts a man trusted because training carved them into bone. And there were instincts older than training, the ones animals carried like Holy Scripture, written in scent and snow. Caleb called Sheriff Grace Hollis before they left. He did not ask permission like a boy. He informed her like a man determined to keep the truth clean. Grace answered on the 2nd ring. "Tell me you're not about to do something stupid." "We may have a lead on Thomas Vale's survey cabin. Public land. Lydia knows of it. Bishop may know the route." There was a pause. "You are not going alone. I wasn't planning to." "Good. Send me your location. Stay on public forest routes. Photograph, don't disturb unless there's immediate safety risk. I'll log the call." "Understood." Caleb ended the call. Lydia watched him. "You really were military." "Still am in some habits." "Good," she said. "My father trusted habits more than hope." The forest road beyond Pine Harbor narrowed into a white corridor between black pines. Caleb drove slowly, following Lydia's directions until the plowed road ended. From there, they walked. Bishop led. He did not move like a young dog. His steps were measured, sometimes stiff, but his nose knew the snow. He paused at windbreaks, sniffed the bark of a fallen pine, circled once near a frozen ditch, then chose the left fork without hesitation. Lydia followed him as if afraid that blinking would make him vanish again. "My dad used to bring him home covered in mud," she said. "Mom would be furious." Solomon would sit there looking noble, like mud was part of his uniform. "Was your mother alive when he disappeared?" Avery asked softly. Lydia shook her head. "She died when I was 19. Cancer. After that, Dad and Solomon became, I don't know, a pair of old monks, both quiet, both stubborn, both terrible at pretending they weren't lonely." Caleb looked at Bishop. He understood too well. After half an hour, the trees opened around a sagging wooden structure nearly swallowed by snow. The cabin leaned to one side, its roof patched with old tin, its windows clouded by frost and time. A faded county survey marker hung beside the door, nearly buried beneath ice. Lydia stopped. "I haven't been here since I was a kid." Caleb approached first, checking the porch boards before putting weight on them. Avery photographed the exterior. Lydia stood with her arms wrapped around herself, breathing as if the past had a smell. Inside, the cabin was cold enough to feel abandoned by God. Dust, old leaves, and snow had gathered along the floorboards. A rusted stove sat in the corner. A broken chair lay on its side. Animal tracks crossed the dust near a gap in the wall, but nothing large seemed to be living there. Bishop entered and went straight to the fireplace. He sniffed the stone base, then moved to the floorboards beside it, and began to dig. Not wildly, not desperately, deliberately. Caleb knelt. "Here?" Bishop scratched again. The floorboard was loose at one end. Caleb photographed it first, then used his multi-tool to lift it carefully. Beneath was a shallow space lined with plastic sheeting. Inside sat a metal lockbox. Lydia made a sound like someone had struck her name out of the air. Caleb lifted the box and set it on the floor. The latch was stiff but not locked. Inside were notebooks sealed in plastic, several small sample tubes wrapped in cloth, folded maps marked with circles and dates, printed photographs of trucks at night, and a small USB drive taped beneath the lid. Lydia reached for the top notebook with trembling hands. On the first page was her father's handwriting. "If this is found, submit copies to State Environmental Review. Do not confront Voss alone." Lydia pressed the page to her chest. For 6 years, the world had given her fog. Maybe accident, maybe storm, maybe grief making monsters out of weather. Now, in a ruined cabin beneath the snow, her father's careful words returned like a lantern. Bishop sat beside her, his old head lowered. Avery wiped at her eyes before pretending she had snow on her lashes. Caleb took photographs of everything before moving the items. Then he called Grace again. "We found a lockbox," he said. "Documents, samples, a USB. Thomas left a note." Grace's voice changed. "Bring it in, directly. Don't stop anywhere." They drove back to Larkspur Falls under a sky turning iron gray. At the sheriff's office, Grace received the lockbox with formal care. She logged every item, photographed seals, and made Caleb, Avery, and Lydia give brief statements. Her calm manner did not hide the fire behind her eyes. "This may be enough to reopen Thomas Vale's case," she said, "and enough to request environmental review." She then called Dr. Miles Hartwell, a state environmental specialist based in Duluth. Miles arrived by video call first, a lean 53-year-old man with short gray hair, a long, serious face, pale blue eyes behind black-framed glasses, and the faintly hunched posture of someone who had spent years bent over maps, soil reports, and government forms. His voice was dry, almost colorless, but his questions were exact. He wore a charcoal sweater under a field parka, even indoors, as if mentally prepared to step into bad weather at any moment. "I knew Thomas Vale," Miles said after seeing the handwriting. "Not well, enough to know he did not fabricate data." "What do you need?" Grace asked. "Chain of custody, current samples from public access points, copies of the maps." "And patience, which no one ever has when poison is involved." By evening, the lockbox was secured. Lydia sat outside the sheriff's office on a bench, Bishop at her feet. Snow drifted beneath the street lamp. "I was angry at him," she said suddenly. Caleb sat beside her. "My dad. For disappearing. For leaving me with questions. For making me live in a town where people whispered and then bought bread like nothing happened." She stroked Bishop's head. "And I was angry at Solomon, too. I thought if he survived, he should have come home." Bishop leaned against her knee. Lydia closed her eyes. Maybe he was trying. Across the street, an old blue truck rolled slowly past. Caleb noticed it immediately. So did Bishop. The German shepherd stood, body rigid, nose lifting toward the exhaust-stained air. The truck did not stop, but Caleb knew the shape of it. Silas Creed. Grace had already connected his plate to complaints from animal auctions in 2 counties. Nothing large enough to jail him yet. Enough to watch him. Enough to know the past was beginning to feel hunted. That night, Caleb returned to his cabin with Bishop just after dark. The first sign was the back door. It was not open, but the snow near the steps had been disturbed, and the lock plate bore a fresh scratch. Caleb told Bishop to stay, then entered carefully, room by room, turning on lights as he went. No one remained inside. But drawers had been opened, papers moved, a cabinet left ajar. Nothing obvious was missing. On the kitchen table lay a scrap of paper weighted by Ranger's old empty bowl. The message was written in block letters. "Stop digging what was buried." Bishop stood in the center of the room, a low growl moving through him like distant thunder. Caleb picked up the note with gloved fingers. For a moment, the cabin seemed to hold every life that had led him here. Ranger's empty bed, Bishop's old name, Thomas Vale's handwriting, Lydia's tears, and the creek sleeping under ice. Caleb had once thought his war ended when he came home. Now he understood some battles did not announce themselves with gunfire. Some began with poisoned water, a vanished man, a dog sold in a cage, and a town that had been taught to whisper instead of speak. He placed one hand on Bishop's head. The old dog leaned into him, not afraid. Caleb looked toward the dark window, where the pines stood like silent witnesses. "All right," he said quietly. "We do this the right way." Bishop's growl faded. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks behind the cabin. But not fast enough. By the time the first state report came back, Larkspur Falls had stopped pretending the creek was only a pretty line on a postcard. Dr. Miles Hartwell did not use dramatic language. The state environmental specialist spoke the way winter thermometers spoke, plainly without mercy. He stood in Sheriff Grace Hollis's office with his gray field parka still zipped to his throat, black-framed glasses low on his nose, and a folder of early test results held in one gloved hand. "The samples from the public access points show contamination markers," he said. "Not enough for a final legal conclusion. Enough for concern. Enough for formal review." Grace stood behind her desk, jaw tight, dark eyes steady. Caleb Rowerski leaned against the wall near the window, arms folded across his long-sleeved green camouflage shirt. His broad shoulders and clean-cut, silver-touched undercut made him look composed, but inside he felt that old, cold readiness returning. Not the hunger for battle. That had never been as glorious as people imagined. This was different. This was the feeling of standing between something defenseless and the thing trying to swallow it. Bishop lay beside his boot. The old German shepherd's yellow-black coat had gained a little shine with rest and care, though his silver muzzle still made him look like a retired warrior who had outlived too many flags. His eyes remained fixed on the folder in Miles's hand, as if paperwork itself had a scent. Miles looked at Caleb. Thomas Vale's notes match several locations where current concerns appear strongest. That matters. Can you move on it? Caleb asked. Not alone. I can request a state field team. But if Voss Ridge has been hiding anything, they'll try to clean it before inspectors arrive. Grace closed the file. Then we document everything we can from public land, and we do it clean. Clean. The word mattered. Caleb had once lived in a world where speed saved lives. Now he lived in a town where patience might save them. Over the next 2 days, Mabel Hart's Bakery became the unofficial heart of the awakening. People came in for bread and left behind memories. Mabel, round and rosy-cheeked in her red cardigan and flour-dusted apron, moved from oven to counter like a general disguised as someone's favorite aunt. She poured coffee, handed out rolls, and said, "If you're going to whisper, at least whisper clearly enough for Grace to write it down." Jonah Reed brought old veterinary bills from his farm, the paper edges worn from being hidden too long. Owen Pike arrived with his green backpack and nature sketchbook clutched to his chest. The 11-year-old still looked small in his navy coat and mustard yellow hat, but he no longer lowered his eyes every time an adult spoke to him. His drawings of Glass Creek were laid beside dates, bird counts, and careful notes about the North Bank. Avery Quinn helped organize everything. The 34-year-old teacher, calm in her olive wool coat and cream scarf, wrote names and dates on index cards while correcting Owen's spelling with the gentleness of someone polishing silver, not scolding a child. Lydia Vale sat near the window with her father's notebook open before her. Her dark brown hair was tied back, her gray-blue eyes shadowed but clear. Some grief made people collapse. Lydia's had hardened into a blade thin enough to slip between lies. Nora Bellamy came and went between appointments, dropping off copies of animal health observations. "I am still not a creek wizard," she reminded everyone, freckled face serious despite the joke. "But I know when too many animals from one area show the same kinds of trouble." By the end of the second day, fear had not vanished from Larkspur Falls. But it had company now. Company made fear smaller. Harlan Voss responded the way powerful men often did when pressure rose beneath them. He polished the surface. He announced a school fundraiser in the town hall, complete with hot cider, speeches, and a photographer from the county paper. He stood beneath a banner about protecting the future, tall and elegant in his black cashmere coat and wine-colored scarf, silver hair combed perfectly back, pale blue eyes warm enough for anyone who did not look too long. "My family has always believed in stewardship," Harlan told the room. "Land, water, children, these are sacred trusts." People clapped, some sincerely, some because they were used to clapping when Harlan paused. Caleb stood near the back with Bishop at his side. He said nothing. Bishop said less. Yet the old dog never took his eyes off Harlan. At one point, Harlan glanced across the room and met Bishop's stare. The smile on his face held. His eyes did not. That was when Caleb understood something important. Harlan was not afraid of Caleb's strength. Men like Harlan knew how to buy lawyers, influence, delay, confusion. He was not afraid of Avery's notes or Jonah's bills by themselves. But Bishop troubled him, not because a dog could testify, because Bishop remembered. Late that night, Grace called Caleb. Her voice was low and clipped. A resident near Ridge Road reported a truck leaving the Voss property by the old forest road. No headlights for part of the way. "I'm checking it." Caleb was already reaching for his coat. "You need Bishop." "I need his nose," Grace said. "And I need you to remember, you're not leading this." "I remember." "Good. Meet us at the Old County Bridge, public side." The Old County Bridge crossed a narrow bend of Glass Creek where the water moved under broken ice. Snow fell in thin, slanted lines beneath the beams of Grace's patrol lights. A deputy stood near the roadblock, and Miles arrived in a state truck with testing gear secured in the back. Caleb parked behind Grace's cruiser. Bishop climbed down stiffly but alert. Avery arrived next, carrying a camera and wearing her beige scarf pulled up against the cold. Lydia came with copies of Thomas Vale's marked maps sealed in a plastic folder. No one spoke loudly. Even the creek seemed to hush beneath its ice. Grace pointed toward the tree line. "Tire tracks leave the county road there. That strip is public easement until the stone marker. We stay on this side unless there's legal cause." Bishop's nose lifted. He pulled once toward the pines. Caleb let him lead, but kept the leash short. Snow muffled their steps. The flashlight beams moved over trunks, brush, and low drifts. A few minutes in, Bishop stopped near a patch of disturbed snow beside an old service trail. Fresh tire tracks cut through the white. Miles crouched, shining his light. Heavy vehicle. Recent. Grace photographed the tracks. Avery filmed from behind the marker. They followed the trail to a clearing that sat just within the public easement, a forgotten utility turnaround half buried in snow. There, beneath a tarp hastily dragged over them, stood several old metal drums and 2 plastic containers marked with faded warning symbols. No one touched them. The smell was enough. Metallic, bitter, wrong. Bishop growled. From the far side of the clearing, a man cursed. Silas Creed stepped from behind a truck, his scarred face hard beneath a dark beanie, his old leather jacket dusted with snow. He looked thinner than Caleb remembered, more cornered, and cornered men were often foolish enough to mistake panic for courage. "What are you doing here?" Silas snapped. Grace's voice cut through the clearing. "Sheriff's office. Step away from the vehicle." Silas saw Avery's camera and lunged toward her. "Give me that." Caleb moved first, not with anger, but with trained economy. He stepped between Silas and Avery, catching Silas's arm before the man reached the camera. Silas shoved him hard. Bishop barked once, deep and thunderous, placing himself between Avery and the scuffle. Caleb did not strike. He turned Silas's momentum aside, pinned the man's wrist behind his back, and held him against the truck with just enough pressure to end the argument. "Don't make it worse," Caleb said. Silas spat into the snow. "You have no idea what you stepped into." Grace reached them, cuffs ready. "Then you can explain it downtown." While Grace secured Silas, Bishop suddenly pulled away from Caleb's side. Not toward the drums, toward the creek. "Bishop!" Caleb called. The old dog moved along the bank, nose low, paws careful. Caleb followed, trusting the leash, trusting the animal, more than the snow beneath his boots. Near a cluster of rocks and broken branches, Bishop stopped and began pawing at the edge of a snowbank. The surface gave way. A hidden crust collapsed, revealing a section of old pipe tucked beneath stones and frozen brush. Dark water trickled from it into the creek, staining the ice around it a dull gray. Caleb stepped closer to photograph it. The ice under his left boot cracked. For one suspended second, the world became very quiet. Then Bishop lunged backward, clamping his teeth into Caleb's sleeve and pulling with all the old strength left in him. Caleb staggered back just as the ice broke where his weight had been. Black water opened beneath the snow like an eye. Avery gasped. Lydia whispered, "Solomon!" Caleb dropped to one knee on solid ground, one hand buried in Bishop's fur. The old dog released his sleeve and pressed his shoulder against Caleb's chest, breathing hard. There it was, the rehook no one could have planned, not evidence, not accusation. A rescue. Bishop had led them to the hidden pipe, then pulled Caleb away from the creek before the cold could take him. Ranger had once saved Caleb from the darkness inside his mind. Bishop had just saved him from the dark water beneath the ice. For the first time, Caleb did not feel one love replacing another. He felt them standing together. "Good boy," Caleb whispered, voice rough. "Good old man." Miles moved in carefully, photographing the pipe from a safe distance. "That," he said, all dryness gone from his voice, "is enough to freeze this site." Grace radioed for state support and additional units. Within half an hour, the clearing was alive with lights, blue, white, amber. They flashed over the snow, over the drums, over the old pipe, over faces that had grown pale in the cold. Then Harlan Voss arrived. He stepped from a black SUV as if entering a boardroom, his coat immaculate despite the weather. His eyes moved from Grace to Miles, from the drums to Caleb, and finally to Bishop. "Sheriff," Harlan said, smooth as polished stone, "there appears to be a misunderstanding." Grace stood in his path. "This is an active investigation scene. On public land, I believe? Exactly why we are standing here." Harlan's smile tightened. "You are allowing a former soldier with emotional difficulties and an old dog to guide a legal inquiry." Caleb said nothing. Lydia did. She stepped forward, Thomas's notebook held against her chest. "My father tried to tell this town what was happening." Harlan's gaze flicked to her. "Miss Vale, grief can make patterns where none exist." Owen appeared behind Mabel near the roadblock, his sketchbook clutched in both hands. Mabel had brought him and half the town, though she insisted later she had only followed the lights because she was nosy with moral purpose. "He saw patterns too," Owen said, voice shaking but clear. "In the birds, in the fish, in everything that stopped coming back." Jonah Reed lifted his old folder. "My herd records are dated." Avery held up her camera. "The site was documented before anything was disturbed." Nora, arriving breathless in her clinic parka, added, "And animal reports are logged." Miles looked at Harlan over his glasses. "The state will determine what the materials are. Not gossip, not money, not reputation." Grace turned to Harlan. "No one here is convicting you by feeling. We are preserving evidence." For the first time since Caleb had met him, Harlan Voss had no beautiful sentence ready. Silas sat in the back of the cruiser, shouting through the window that he wanted a lawyer. Grace's deputy logged the drums. Miles's team marked the pipe. The creek kept moving beneath its broken skin. The town watched, and watching became a kind of courage. By midnight, Silas had been taken in for questioning on obstruction, illegal dumping-related activity, pending investigation, and prior animal trade complaints now under review. Harlan was not dragged away in handcuffs. Grace was too careful for theater. But his vehicle was held at the scene, his statements recorded, and his estate placed under emergency environmental scrutiny. That mattered more than drama. It meant the wall had cracked. When the work lights finally softened, and the crowd thinned, Lydia stood near the creek bank with Thomas Vale's notebook in her arms. Snow settled in her dark hair. Her gray-blue eyes shone, but she did not cry this time. Bishop walked to her. She knelt and rested one hand on his silver muzzle. "You remembered the way," she whispered. "All this time." The old German shepherd leaned into her palm. Caleb stood a few feet away, watching the lights tremble on the ice. He thought of Ranger's empty bed, of Bishop's cage, of Thomas's handwriting, of Owen standing braver than he believed himself to be, of Mabel turning a bakery into a war room with cinnamon rolls and righteous fury. He had believed Bishop came to him because the dog needed saving. Now he understood the mercy had been larger than that. Bishop had come to lead Caleb out of private grief and into a promise big enough to hold a town. Grace approached, snow creaking beneath her boots. "You all right?" she asked. Caleb looked down at Bishop, then at Glass Creek. "No," he said honestly, "but I'm standing." Grace nodded. "That counts." Bishop returned to Caleb's side, tired now, leaning lightly against his leg. The old dog had not spoken a word. Yet somehow, beneath the winter lights and the watching pines, he had said what the town most needed to hear. The creek was not safe yet. The truth was not finished yet. But silence had been broken. Spring did not arrive in Larkspur Falls like a trumpet. It came quietly, drop by drop, from the eaves of old barns and the branches of black pines. It came as a thin line of water beneath the ice on Glass Creek. It came in the muddy footprints outside Mabel Hart's bakery and in the first brave calls of chickadees returning to the fence posts. Winter was not gone. Not yet. Snow still rested in the shaded places. The mornings still bit at the skin. Bishop still woke slowly some days, his old joints stiff beneath his yellow-black coat, his silver muzzle resting longer on his paws before he decided the world was worth standing for. But something had changed. Larkspur Falls had stopped whispering. After the night at Glass Creek, the State Environmental Office opened a formal investigation into the Voss Ridge property. Dr. Miles Hartwell returned with a full field team, more equipment, and the same dry expression that made every lie in the room feel underdressed. Crews marked sections of the creek, tested soil, sealed the hidden pipe, and removed old containers from the public easement under state supervision. No one declared victory. Grace Hollis made sure of that. The sheriff stood at Town Hall one gray morning, tall and steady in her dark winter uniform, her brown eyes moving across the gathered residents. She did not promise miracles. She did not say justice would be quick. She said the investigation was active, evidence had been preserved, and the state had placed restrictions on several parts of Voss Ridge pending review. Harlan Voss did not appear in handcuffs before the town, and that disappointed some people who loved dramatic endings more than real ones. But his estate gates were no longer untouchable. His lawyers no longer sounded like thunder. His name was no longer spoken as if money itself could become holiness. That was enough for the first crack in the old wall. Silas Creed remained under investigation for illegal animal trade complaints, obstruction, and his involvement near the dumping site. Grace warned people not to turn rumor into revenge. "We are not becoming what frightened us," she said. Caleb respected that. He had known men who confused justice with hunger. Grace did not. In the weeks that followed, Mabel's Bakery became something warmer than a business. It became a place where people brought stories they had carried too long. Mabel, 64, and round as a Christmas loaf, with silver curls and pale blue eyes that could laugh and mourn in the same breath, kept coffee hot and judgment measured. "Truth goes down better with butter," she declared, sliding cinnamon rolls onto the counter. Jonah Reed came in one morning with his hat in his hands. The 58-year-old farmer looked older than he had on the trail, his weathered face lined by years of work and years of silence. He gave Grace copies of old records and apologized to Mabel for not speaking sooner. Mabel patted his arm. "Honey, if fear made people silent forever, churches would have no hymns." That became the kind of sentence people repeated until it sounded like town wisdom. Owen Pike changed too. The boy who had once hidden in a shed now stood in front of Avery Quinn's class with his sketchbook open. He was still small, still thin, still wearing that mustard yellow hat even indoors, until Avery gently reminded him that classrooms did not snow. But his blue-gray eyes no longer ran from every gaze. He showed drawings of Glass Creek from past winters, birds, fish, deer tracks, ice patterns, the north bank, the feeder stream. His hand shook at first, then Bishop, lying at the front of the classroom like an elderly school inspector, gave one soft sigh. The children laughed. Owen smiled. After that his voice steadied. Avery, tall and calm in her olive coat and cream scarf, stood at the back of the room with her arms folded. Her eyes shone, but she did not interrupt. Good teachers knew when silence was the best kind of applause. From that day, Owen and several classmates formed a small nature group called the Creek Watchers. They were not allowed near restricted areas, and Miles insisted on safety rules so detailed even Mabel called them government poetry. But every week, under adult supervision, they recorded birds, tracks, water clarity, and signs of returning life. They made a sign for their notebook box. Small eyes see what busy eyes miss. Caleb liked that. He thought Bishop might have written it if dogs had thumbs and patience for spelling. Lydia Vale began visiting Caleb's cabin on Sundays. At first, she came for Bishop. She would kneel beside him on the porch, her dark brown hair loose beneath a wool cap, her gray-blue eyes softening whenever she called him Solomon. Bishop answered to both names now. Bishop belonged to Caleb's present. Solomon belonged to Thomas Vale's past. The old dog seemed to carry them without confusion, as if love did not need a single name to be true. Lydia was 28, slender and strong-handed, usually wearing her brown canvas jacket, dusted with sawdust from her restoration workshop. She had lived too long with unanswered grief, and now that answers had begun to arrive, she did not know whether to feel lighter or more broken. One Sunday, Caleb found her standing near the fireplace, looking at Bishop's blanket beside Ranger's old bed. "I thought I might want to take him home," she said. Caleb said nothing. His chest tightened, but he kept his face calm. Lydia turned to him. "Everyone probably thought that. He was my father's dog." He was. Bishop slept between them, one ear twitching in a dream. Lydia smiled sadly. "But he chose you." Caleb looked down. "He didn't choose me because he forgot Dad," she continued. "He chose you because Dad's promise needed someone who would listen, and because you needed him, too." Caleb swallowed. Lydia touched Bishop's head. "Solomon finished his work. Bishop deserves his home." The words entered Caleb quietly, then spread through him like warmth, finding a room that had been closed all winter. A week later, at Larkspur Veterinary Care, Caleb signed the adoption papers. "Doctor." Nora Bellamy handed him the clipboard with a grin. Nora, compact and quick in her white coat over pale blue scrubs, freckles bright across her fair face, looked far too pleased with herself. "This is purely ceremonial," she said. "That dog adopted you the moment you put him in the passenger seat." Caleb signed anyway. Bishop sat beside him wearing a new plain brown leather collar. He looked bored by paperwork, which Caleb considered further proof of wisdom. Nora checked his weight and nodded. Still old, still dramatic, much improved. Bishop gave her a look. "Don't start," she told him. "I've been judged by cats with more legal authority than you." Caleb laughed. Not a small surprise sound this time, a real laugh. It startled Nora enough that she looked at him over the clipboard, then softened. "There it is," she said. "What?" "The man under the weather." Caleb did not know how to answer that, so he scratched Bishop behind the ear and let the dog answer by leaning against his leg. The rehook came near the end of March, on a morning when the creek ice began to break. Caleb and Bishop walked to the public bank of Glass Creek, where the restricted signs stood farther upstream and the safe path wound through thawing snow. The air smelled of wet pine and exposed earth. Water moved beneath the melting ice, with a sound so small Caleb almost missed it. Bishop stopped beside a flat stone near the bank. He lowered his nose. Then he pawed gently at the mud, not digging hard, not searching with urgency, just brushing aside leaves and thawed soil until a small green shoot appeared between the stones, a wild iris, too early, too fragile, almost ridiculous in its bravery. Caleb crouched beside it. Bishop touched the tiny shoot with his nose, then sat back. For a moment Caleb thought of Ranger, of the old black collar, now resting safely in a wooden box at home. He thought of Thomas Vale, whose truth had waited 6 years beneath snow and fear. He thought of Lydia's tears, Owen's shaking voice, Mabel's stubborn kindness, Grace's steady law, and Bishop's old body refusing to stop remembering the way. A flower had no courtroom power. It could not convict Harlan Voss. It could not clean the creek in a day. But there it was, green and alive beside water everyone had nearly given up on. Caleb placed his hand on Bishop's head. "Looks like something still wants to grow," he whispered. Bishop leaned against him. The old dog did not need to answer. By April, a section of land near the creek was approved as a small community restoration area. It was not grand. A few acres, a trail, a volunteer cleanup schedule, and a wooden sign carved by Lydia's own hands. Vale Creek Sanctuary. In memory of Thomas Vale. For every truth that waited beneath the snow. At the dedication, Mabel brought biscuits. Nora checked Bishop's joints and pretended not to cry. Miles gave a short speech, so factual it somehow became moving. Grace stood with her hat tucked under one arm, watching the town gather without fear. Owen and the creek watchers planted stakes for future observation points. Avery helped the children hang drawings of birds along a temporary fence. Caleb stayed near the back. He was still not a man who liked attention, but he no longer mistook distance for safety. At home, the cabin changed. Ranger's bed remained beside the hearth. Caleb did not remove it. Instead, he placed Bishop's thick gray blanket near it, close enough that the two spaces seemed to share the fire. Love, he learned, did not need one memory to move out before another could move in. Some nights, Bishop slept on his own blanket. Some nights, he stretched one paw onto Ranger's bed as if greeting an old soldier he had never met. Caleb stopped correcting him. Mabel created a new item at the bakery called Bishop's Biscuit, which was absolutely not a dog treat, though every dog in town disagreed. Caleb told her the name would confuse people. Good, she said. Confused people by two. At the first spring market, the same barn that had once held winter cold opened its doors to sunlight. The rafters were decorated with paper birds made by Avery's students. A table near the entrance offered information about adopting senior animals. Another table collected donations for creek restoration. Lydia displayed a framed photograph of her father with Solomon beside him. Owen proudly wore a handmade creek watcher's badge pinned crookedly to his jacket. Bishop walked beside Caleb through the center aisle, slow, steady, silver-muzzled. People stepped aside, not out of pity now, but respect. No cage waited at the back door. No cruel laughter followed him. Near the center of the barn hung a small painted sign, "No living soul becomes worthless by growing old." Caleb stood beneath it for a long moment. He remembered the first day, but not as a wound now, as a doorway. Mabel tucked a paper bag into his hand. For later. One for you, one for his honor. Bishop sniffed the bag. Caleb said, "He knows." "He always does," Mabel replied. Lydia joined them, resting one hand briefly on Bishop's back. Dad would have loved this. Caleb looked at the crowd, the drawings, the children, the old dog beside him. "He probably does," he said. Outside, Glass Creek ran beneath the spring light, not fully healed, not fully clean, but moving. That was enough. Caleb had once believed he bought an old dog with a few folded bills on a winter morning. Now he knew better. He had been handed a witness, a companion, a mission, and a mirror. Bishop had not erased Ranger. He had not erased the war, or grief, or the years Caleb spent mistaking loneliness for peace. He had simply led him, step by step, back toward life. And in Larkspur Falls, where snowmelt ran through pine roots and old secrets finally met the sun, an old German shepherd walked beside a former Navy SEAL like a small, stubborn miracle with 4 tired paws. Sometimes God does not send miracles with thunder, lightning, or a voice from the sky. Sometimes he sends them quietly, through an old dog sitting in a rusted cage, through a lonely man who still has enough love left to stop, through a child brave enough to tell the truth, through a small town learning that silence can be broken and that healing can begin even after years of fear. Caleb thought he was rescuing Bishop from the cold, but in truth, Bishop was also rescuing Caleb from the winter inside his own heart. That is the strange beauty of kindness. We often believe we are giving it away, only to discover that it returns to us in a form we never expected. This story reminds us that no life is useless because it has grown old. No heart is beyond healing because it has been broken, and no act of compassion is ever too small for God to use. In our daily lives, we may pass by people, animals, and moments that seem ordinary. But sometimes the smallest choice to care, to listen, to stop, to help can become the beginning of a miracle. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this still matter, Please subscribe to our channel so we can keep sharing tales of loyalty, courage, faith, and love. May God bless you, your family, your home, and every gentle soul who still chooses kindness in a world that often forgets how powerful it can be.